And like that, we're live. Just like that. That's how we do things around here. No fancy fanfare, no state of the art graphic animation intro, although that might be nice. It might be nice just to have that really rousing introduction, get people fired up for the weather. Now we just click go and off we go. How is everybody? It is Tuesday the 18th, and we are cycling out of Phoenix Astro Aries season. Yeah, Phoenix Astro. We are cycling out of Aries season, and clearly it is a very intense and fascinating transition from one sign to another as we get this eclipse coming at us on the 19th and 20th. And I talked at great length, a great deal about it on Sunday night. And I think it's a really powerful eclipse. And we've been in this eclipse energy for a week and a half, and just some of the stuff that has come out during this pre-eclipse cycle. And I keep thinking about the young man, Jack Teixeira, who essentially spilled the beans on the United States and Ukraine, and again, that just really completely lines up with the military, obviously, with the Pentagon being an Aries institution, and things that emerge that are hidden, right? I mean, that's part of the energy of the eclipse. It's a very interesting phenomena, in that certain things that we normally know to be quote unquote true, like the program gets interrupted during an eclipse. That's what happens. The program gets interrupted. And this disclosure of what's going on in Ukraine, troops on the ground, all this other stuff, is not business as usual. And again, there are people who say he's a shill or a psyop or whatever. I would question everybody who thinks that, why that would be so. Why would that be so? What would the United States, theoretically United States government, which is really not the United States anymore, hasn't been for a while, what they would gain or benefit from that kind of disclosure? An easy out. The other thing too, an easy out from Ukraine. The other thing too is, and we have to also remind ourselves of this, is that the whole Dylan Mulvaney and Budweiser, Bud Light, quote unquote, controversy happened right as the pre-eclipse cycle was taking place. And so when we think of beer, what do we think of? We think of it as being this thing that quote unquote men do, right? I remember when I was young, and the first time I got drunk, it was on beer that was in a keg at my friend's house. I guess my friend's father kept a cold keg on tap inside a refrigerator in the garage. And one day, God, we were really young, we tapped this thing, and it was kind of like a rite of passage, right? I mean, this is what unfortunately has passed, or rites of passage for men in the West, is to get drunk. And the first time you get drunk is kind of like that rite of passage in a lot of ways. So we associate beer with men, by and large, right? I mean, this is what, theoretically men do. Go back and watch commercials from the 1970s or 80s, and you will get nothing but beer commercials that are that have ex-athletes as their pitch people, not somebody who is masquerading as a woman, right? So it's a very different version of the universe. But that's, again, that's beer is related to men. And so when we have this pre-eclipse cycle, even the eclipse energy around that, which is revealing, it's very revealing. And So we see things during an eclipse sometimes that we don't normally see. It interrupts the program. It disrupts the program, and we're still a couple days away from it. Tomorrow night, I guess, late tomorrow night, leading into Thursday, we'll get more of that kind of intense, and then intense eclipse energy. And even after that, like a week and a half after, we're still in that cycle. And then the effects of the eclipse are felt for possibly months, right? So now we're moving into this other eclipse cycle, which takes us into October. We'll have a lunar eclipse, and I'll talk about that, not today, but we'll have a lunar eclipse coming up when the moon moves into its full phase, not long from now. But this eclipse is really related to the October and then April eclipse of next year. 3 biggies and 3 eclipses that will literally reshape the United States of America. All right, so let's get into the astro weather. Since I've been talking about big picture stuff, let's get into a smaller frame for a minute or two here. And you can see just how the eclipse energy is starting to line up. We have the moon at 7 Aries, so it's not quite new. It is balsamic and coming in later today in a conjunction with Chiron. And I think my take on this is there's a huge amount of anger in the air. There's a huge amount of anger and outrage today. It is. You can tap it like a keg. How's that for a beer metaphor? You can tap the outrage like a keg. And again, what's interesting is looking at this whole pre-eclipse event with Bud Light in Mars and Cancer, and how Mars and Cancer becomes very defensive and defends its territory and defends its turf, whether it's beer or masculinity or femininity in this regard, or even things that are related to quote unquote values. Mars and Cancer, normally I wouldn't say it's a passive sign per se, it's a passive aggressive sign, has come out swinging, right? Mars and Cancer has really come out swinging over the last week and a half. And there seems to be even more energy around defending the turf of conservatism or normalcy. There's certainly more of that in the air right now. And today and later tonight, that energy gets really stirred up. And we live in a very strange time, if we could call it a time at all, when these energies seem to accumulate without ever truly being discharged. Now, every now and then we'll have an event, some kind of a public event, where theoretically the energy is discharged. But we've been in a space of accumulation for quite a while. And I think we could be looking at the peak of that accumulation over this eclipse cycle. And we can just see where people are just sick, and pardon my language, are sick and fucking tired of being bullied, being told what to do, what to believe, what to buy, what to believe in. I mean, this energy is starting to reach what I would call a concrescence. Although it's not quite totally there. Just wait till the nodes go into Aries. When the true node goes into Aries, that's an adult dose, right? But we're working up to this now. And whether it's a boycott or whatever you want to call this thing with Budweiser, Mars and Cancer is playing a role. And in a strange moment of galvanization, this event has done more to bring people together than a proxy war in Ukraine. If you think about it, it's done more to bring people together than the outrage of a proxy war in Ukraine, a war that nobody's ever really passed via Congress as a war. So this energy is not going away, and we're moving into this eclipse cycle and beyond the next few days. And we have Mars again squaring off against the moon and squaring off against Chiron. Still in a Y trine with Saturn, 8 degrees. So some of this has long-standing effects. It's really fascinating to think of reality, so-called reality. And we go about our business, and a lot of times we just react like earthworms. When we're touched, or somebody decides that they're going to cut open an earthworm, or cut an earthworm in half, and see what happens. And the earthworm kind of wiggles around, and there's this stimuli. And a lot of us are like that when it comes to just reacting into the world. We don't understand the potential of the downstream effect. So we don't understand completely how a 16 or a 17 or an 18-year-old might view this whole Budweiser affair. We don't understand that, right? We just think of the now, and in Aries, now is really all that counts. But these are events that shape people and shape people's consciousness. And back when I was looking at Aquarius, and I looked at Andrew Breitbart, for him, it was what happened with Clarence Thomas, who's in trouble. But it was what happened with Clarence Thomas that became his red pill moment. And he might have been about 17 or 18 years old at the time. And then that wound up shaping him, and him creating Breitbart, which I talked about during Aquarius season. But it's events that we're witnessing today, like this whole thing with Bud Light and the boycott, and even the Jack Teixeira stuff. These are all part of the mix, right? And so it's an interesting look at the Mars-Saturn trine. We think of our own ability and capacity to be effective and function in the world, and we personalize the elements, the aspects, and the trends of the chart. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is one of the reasons why I'm here. But we also have to take into consideration the long-term effects of a transit like this, and what's happening in terms of the external environment, and some of the changes that it will have an impact on younger people who are witnessing the times that we're in. And so when we see this Mars-Saturn trine, and then remember, they both started off at 0-0. To me, it represents an interesting historical arc when we look at, quite honestly, young people, and how an event or events like these shape them and affect their consciousness in a lot of ways. So yes, it has a personal application. We've talked about how it's really good to find something that you can do long term, right? This is the long term, the long view expression of Mars-Saturn trine, and especially in the two water signs, because you want to also do something that you easily flow towards, right? That's the whole idea with water. You don't want to fight against it. You want to find where the flow is. So we've been well into this transit for about 3.5 weeks now. So that's the longer, more collective version of the story. One of the things that I probably should talk more about is Pluto, and how it's at the degree of the super conjunction, which took place in December 21st of 2020, and set the clock at Jupiter and Saturn at 0 Aquarius. And so Pluto comes in that super conjunction. And again, looking at this whole experience of being a human and experiencing time, right? Or experiencing time, culture, law. That's what Jose Arguelles called it. It was his foundations: time, culture, and law. The events that happen now with Pluto at 0 Aquarius loop back into that super conjunction. And the super conjunction is almost like the Titans fighting to see who will rule the heavens. Will it be beneficent and jovial Jupiter, or will it be the much more strict, disciplined, authoritarian, satanic, Saturnian Saturn, right? That's really what we're going through for the next 20 years, or at least since 2020. So Pluto in Aquarius informs that period. So the events that happen that are conjunct, the degree of the super conjunction, play a significant role in that cosmic drama of order and freedom, right? Because Jupiter is about freedom and license to express and expand oneself without limitation, right? And Saturn is the exact opposite of that, even though they're neighbors. So again, just look around with what's happening. The other thing that's going on now is the hardcore emergence of Chat GPT. This all happened with Pluto in Aquarius, and the whole AI system is really taking off at light speed. And again, that's gonna play a role, right? It's gonna play a role in the Jupiter Saturn conjunction, and it'll be an interesting role. Will the technology be something that serves us, or will we serve the technology, or the people who are invested in the technology? Interesting tidbit came out yesterday. Larry Page, who was one of the co-founders of Google, came out and said that it was, and maybe still is, to create an AI that is like God, that is godlike. And so this is a really fascinating time, right? With Pluto in Aquarius and the birth, Pluto's birth and death. It is birth and death. Maybe it's rebirth if you're lucky. And then we have the Jupiter Saturn super conjunction with Pluto adding into that, right? It feels to me like it is the inseminating factor for that conjunction. And so what we see go into whatever we can see and witness on the collective level, it is the inseminating factor of the super conjunction. And we'll be back here again. There's more. There's more. There's more to this courtship of the hatching of the egg of the quote unquote new age. And we'll continue to come back and revisit that. So we talked about the frustration mounting here. Venus, Pluto. Venus is really starting to move on a little bit. We got about 2 more degrees before it moves out of that orb with Pluto. So again, we're looking at the potential of commitment, right? Deep, long-term commitment. And even with the Saturn square, which I talked about, that is not a game breaker, right? It is not. Venus Saturn squares can be very, very functional and function quite nicely when it comes to working through things and making sure that people live up to their agreements. And I would say that the Venus Pluto trine is the reward for that. And again, you may not see it immediately, because like with all things Saturn, you have to invest in them. You have to invest in Saturn. But there is a calculus here with the Venus Saturn square and finding how to more than just coexist, but be contractually in agreement with another within the bounds and the bonds of that agreement. And so that means you say no to certain things, right? You say no to certain options, and then you focus on the yes that's left over. And again, with this Venus Pluto trine, which is about to cycle out, there's a reward for that. So this is more long-term thinking. When with all the Aries in the air, the short term is just really right in front of everybody's face. It's all about now. But there are long-term aspects in here that can't be ignored. Mercury is in sextile with Mars. Again, a bit of a repeat in that once you have a solid course of action, you should not hesitate to move on that solid course of action. But Mercury and Taurus is very thorough, right? It is not going to invest in something that it doesn't seem to be excessive or frivolous, perhaps, unless it has something to do with comfort or culture. Well, culture. Last night, I started to read about how certain DVDs now are getting harder to find. I'm like, oh, isn't that interesting? These are DVDs that in the not so distant future might be deemed a bit too colonialist, let's say. So I went on to Amazon last night and I found some great deals on some colonialist DVDs, movies that depict things in ways that maybe 10 years from now might get me arrested. Fahrenheit 451 territory, right? So that's a Mercury Mars sextile. It's like, okay, I want this. Here's my value. Here's the value of the thing. I'm going to buy it. So that's the Astro Weather. I think we've I think the big news and the big story, which obviously we'll return to tomorrow, is the square with Mars and the Moon and Chiron as we move into the eclipse cycle, deep into the heart of the eclipse, and the mounting level of frustration and tension, and the assertion of what I would call more traditional values and the rejection of less traditional values. The sun is getting ready to move into square with Pluto, and that's another big deal. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. I think that has very powerful financial ramifications as part of it. And we talked a little bit about that on Sunday night. All right, let's get into the star of the day. Now, listen, today's star of the day is a little controversial. Would you expect anything less? I had a bit of a tough time in finding the star of the day, but I did. I found him. And if you have an open mind and want to learn from astrology and have a glimmer into the truth, then today's star of the day might be somebody that you may or may not have heard of, but might open your eyes in a way that might make you feel a bit uncomfortable. But that's what the truth is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable at times, because it's not easy to swallow. Sometimes it's easy to swallow. Sometimes it is, but not always. So as I've did the wind up for today's star of the day, the very controversial Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And Menachem Mendel Schneerson became more commonly known as the Rebbe. And you can see right out of this is an illustration of him. You can see the Saturn hypercube right on his third eye, right? I mean, I've always found this to be, I remember the first time I saw somebody wear that, it was at Findhorn. I'm like, what the fuck? This guy has a box on his head. And it was such a weird moment at Findhorn. And he, the group encounter thing was kind of big there. And he felt so emboldened to wear that on his third eye that it was a statement for him. But he felt strong enough inside of himself to make this extreme statement about his belief. It's kind of like running around and encountering somebody who decides that they want to strap a cross to their back and go throughout the business of their day. It's a very weird image, but it is the hyper Saturn cube, and it's right there in the third eye. So it represents a form of transmission in a lot of ways, that this is the point of connection with theoretically the planet Saturn. And this is a very controversial quote because he's the controversial person. And the quote is, "A Jew is not created as a means for some other purpose. He himself is the purpose, since the substance of all divine emanations was created only to serve the Jews," which is a very radical statement, right? I mean, think of somebody in Catholicism or someone in Christianity coming out and saying this. Well, they would be pilloried, or somebody in Islam, and sometimes maybe it does get said in Islam. I don't know. I don't follow the modern prophets or the imams all that closely. And so what Schneerson was also very interested in was the whole concept of time. He was kind of a time freak. He kept talking about losing time. You don't want to lose time. You don't want to waste your moments, right? So we see this here with Saturn and Capricorn. I went through a number of his quotes, and time is a concept that shows up a lot. And the thing about Schneerson is that he was quite controversial even within his own religious community. People who are quote unquote Reformed Jews had a real problem with him. they had a real problem with the whole Chabad system, because it's through Schneerson that the Chabad system and the Chabad network gets created. And by the way, today is like National Education and Awareness Day, or some day, and it's attributed to this guy. And they petitioned Jimmy Carter to make this. It was supposed to be National Education Day based on Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And if you go down the Chabad rabbit hole, you're going to run into people like Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump and a lot more people. It is a very significant, very powerful, very influential network inside of Judaism that not all Jews agree upon as being a representative expression of their faith. So what about his chart? Let's get into the chart. Scorpio rising. He's got that Scorpio rising intensity and the true node in Scorpio. And so he's here to transform. And literally he took the Chabad system or the Chabad network, which was scant. It was scant, and he turned it into a worldwide power. Okay, a worldwide power. The Chabad network, as it is, did not exist prior to this guy's power, influence, and muscle. And he is, how would I describe him in terms of his worldview? I would say that he is, to some degree, a contrarian. To some degree, he's a contrarian. I would also add in that he is definitely a radical. Like, he is a radical expression with the Grand Cross, which is, again, it's in mutable phase or mutable signs. So theoretically, when you have a mutable Grand Cross, kind of mastering the cross can be a bit easier. You know, the whole idea with the Grand Cross is this idea of mastery, right? Like this is in many regards a representation of the Saturn hypercube, right? You can see it here. And if you got a Grand Cross in your chart, you have a challenging chart, but it's the work of a lifetime. And so people that have Grand Crosses need to have grand visions or grand goals or grand aspirations, so that they can put the muscle to it. Now, whatever, you know, whether or not you agree or disagree with some of his views, which again are quite extreme, they're very extreme. And if you're outside of the sphere of the philosophical and canonical influence, philosophical, religious, and canonical influence of Schneerson, you would be shocked by some of the things that are shared. But on the other hand, he was also known as a quote unquote church scholar and wrote tomes and tomes and tomes of tracts regarding the rabbis that had lived previously to him, and was a well-known scholar in his circle on the Kabbalah. And the modern day Kabbalah movement can also be linked to Menachem Schneerson. And so we have Uranus in Sagittarius, and it's in the second house, which is, again, Uranus in the second house is radical. Like, you've got to be able to do your own thing. Whenever it comes to money, finances, and resources, Uranus is the free radical of the second house, and it's in Sagittarius. So we're dealing with religion, and it's a radical take and expression to some degree of religious belief and faith. And we know that Sagittarius can have a tendency of being a zealot, right? And so here it's retrograde, and it's in an interesting position, retrograde. And if you look at what he did with the Chabad network, which he inherited from his father-in-law, actually, he turned it into this powerhouse of a global network, whether you like it or not, right? It's taking something here in the second house and retrofitting it, right? And Uranus here is in the service of itself. with the sun in Aries and Mars in Aries and Mercury in Aries. And it's funny because, again, one of the things, if you go back into his quotes, he talks a lot about the now and missing the moment. There are some things that he shares. If you're looking, like if I didn't tell you that this guy was the godfather of an extremist sect of Judaism, and I just gave you some of his quotes, you would say, wow, that's pretty enlightened. That's pretty smart. Yeah, that has meaning. Isn't that interesting? Right. So now we get into Gemini in the duality, in the polarity of something very deep in this guy's chart. 8th house Pluto, 8th house Neptune, Pluto in opposition with Uranus. That's a heavy opposition. And here there's this whole network, right, that's hidden. Other people's money, Gemini, dual purpose. And then we have Pluto squaring off against Venus. And Venus-Pluto squares, I just talked about them, right? I talked about Venus-Pluto, the Venus-Pluto trine, Venus-Pluto square, Venus-Pluto squares. And please, if you have one in your chart, it doesn't mean that you are a tyrannical false messiah. What it means is that there are pieces associated with this aspect that are quite intense. And in the extreme version of a Venus-Pluto square, the person will use anything at their means necessary to accrue power through relationship. Okay, that's the nature of the Venus-Pluto square. When we talk about the Venus-Pluto square, Venus conjunct Pluto, we're having a discussion about Venus and Scorpio, and those are relationships that are essentially built on power, psychological power, monetary power, financial power, right, sexual power. And in the square, again, there is a tendency to challenge, sort of in some ways, the status quo in some ways, but there's also an inherent obsession that the individual has, right? And then over here we have the moon in Virgo, which I think is really intense as far as this Grand Cross goes, being that the moon in Virgo is extremely critical, right? So this is an individual who, even though incredibly self-possessed, with all of the Aries just lined up and tapping right into Uranus, and being able to move on things that are, we would think, if we really step back and looked at them as being quite radical, right? I mean, this guy's got a lot of energy. He's got a lot of juice. He has a lot of influence. But there's also the moon in Virgo, which I think lends itself to an immense amount of guilt, an incredible amount of guilt, and some absolutely almost masochistic desire to be perfect, right, with the moon in Virgo, and even putting certain relationships at risk to achieve or attain some degree or form of perfection. And it's right in there with the Pluto square. This is a very intense Grand Cross, very intense. And then down here we have Chiron and Vesta and Saturn. And these are the planetary forces squaring off against all of the Aries energy. So this guy's at war, right? He's at war. And in his mind, he has to do everything in his power to win his version of what he would call a spiritual or religious war. And again, when we have the Venus-Pluto square, we start to come into the territory of by any means necessary. And look at the Jupiter-Pluto trine, and the amount of resources available to this individual is tremendous. Absolutely tremendous. A lot. We're talking a lot of do, re, mi, right? And one of the things that he was considered to be the quote unquote Moshiach during his time, and he denied this. Although he wouldn't deny it fervently. He would deny it, but he didn't mind indulging in the idea that he was an incarnation of the Messiah, but he also was, quote unquote, paving the way for the Messiah or the Moshiach. And so this guy is a really powerful, very influential figure. And like I said, he even has like a national day named after him today in the United States. So he certainly made his mark on this, make his mark through the aggregation of the Chabad network of worship. Now, again, I hope that you found this information at the very least enlightening. And I've done everything in my power to look at this chart and be quite fair. At the end of the day, what we're looking at here is an exposition of something that I would call utterly extreme. All right. That brings us to the end of the show. The end of the weather. Kind of a long weather, but when you get into territory like that, in a chart like that, number one, I have to be fair to the chart and fair to the system, right? And I also have to be fair to the historical context and the information in general. And sometimes it takes some working through. All right, let's do a little happy birthday for Kaylikt. We're just going to call her Kaylikt today for brevity's sake. And for brevity's sake, this is a 53-minute video. And Kaylikt, I hope you find it at the very least amusing. Here we go. It is the happy birthday dancing chimps. This is chimps doing river dance. This is the happy birthday river dance chimps birthday celebration. Here we go. For you, Kaylikt, and for all of you other solar returners out there, this one's for you. Right. Please join me over on 15 Minutes of Flame in about a half an hour. And we're going to get into some of the deeper geopolitical and cosmic issues of the day. Some of them are global, some of them are local. But dive we will. Right over there, 15 Minutes of Flame, 9:11 a.m. Central Standard Time. Use your head in order to discern what's real, your heart, two-step what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix. Thanks for being here. And meet me back here tomorrow at 8 a.m. Central Standard Time for another edition of